It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the ASUS ROG OLED PG34WCDM. The OSD is controlled by a little joystick behind this little logo here. So you've got a little joystick and you've got a dedicated power button plus a shortcut key. Before going through any of this, I want to just quickly show you the lighting features. I've already shown you one, that little ROG logo. That's actually the power indicator. You can turn that off if you prefer. The other lighting features are found in lighting effect. So if you want to control some of them with software, you select Aura Sync here. Otherwise you're using Aura RGB. So I'm just going to set this to rainbow. So there's a little pixelated ROG eye at the rear. You can see there are various other patterns, or you can select a static color if you prefer. There's also light in motion, and that's a little red projection onto the desk beneath the monitor. 3 different brightness levels, that's level 2 and that's level 3. So personally I don't really care for these lighting features. I quite like the pixelated ROG logo, although I can only see that from the back, and the back of my monitor faces a wall, so I can't actually appreciate it under normal conditions. If you open up the menu, which you can do by pressing the joystick in, and then go to My Favorite, you can customize the shortcut keys. So there's that button I talked about, which is just to the left of the joystick. But if you move the joystick to the right, up, or down, they are additional shortcut keys if you do that before you've entered the main menu system. So you can set these to various different things, as you can see there. So customize setting 1 and customize setting 2, you can save all of your settings to setting 1 or setting 2 here and quickly load them. So that is everything you set in the menu. You can recall 2 sets of settings there. Before going any further, I'd like to address the question, what are the best settings for this monitor? And by best settings, I mean the settings which worked for me. They worked on my unit and according to the colorimeter targets, which I typically go for in reviews. Each individual unit differs and everyone is going to have their own preferences. When you first turn the monitor on and try to change some things, it should ask you if you want to set it to standard mode rather than power saving mode. You do. If you have it set to power saving mode, it greatly restricts your settings. So you can see a lot of the menus grayed out. I set brightness to 60. And that got around my usual 160 nit target. But of course the brightness will depend on your own preferences and also your lighting environment. This is also with uniform brightness enabled. If you disable that, then it can go potentially brighter as explored in the review, but you have less stability, so it's going to dim when there is more bright content on the screen. If you have uniform brightness enabled, the fluctuation is very slight, so it's just a more consistent experience, which I much prefer for SDR. There are also some game visual presets. I prefer using racing mode, or you could use user. They're the same if you set them up in the same way. Most of the other settings make other adjustments. So scenery mode's just super saturated and it looks really funky. Cinema mode is kind of the same but looks a bit dimmer. Perhaps the gamma's a bit higher. RTS RPG, again, looks funky for different reasons. It's oversaturated and the gamma looks pretty high. FPS mode, it retains that strange oversaturated look. And when I say oversaturated, it actually crushes shades together, all of this. You lose shade variety. This monitor has a good level of saturation out of the box using its native gamut. You really shouldn't want to have this extra boost in saturation. But if you do, perhaps for competitive reasons, it can make for a sort of simpler visual environment perhaps, then you can actually adjust that manually, which I'll come on to later. Then you might like these settings, or you can adjust the saturation slider yourself. And note this oversaturation in some of the presets is with the saturation slider set to its correct neutral position of 50, so you can't overcome this extra saturation. It's a separate filter which you can't control. So yes, FPS mode also reduces the gamma, sets that to 2.0. You could reduce it further if you want to lift out dark details even more. There's sRGB Cal mode. That's one of the sRGB emulation settings. I explore this in the review, and as I mentioned, it is more restrictive than the other one. So you can see the colour menu is greyed out. You can't set contrast if you happen to want to change that, and you can't control uniform brightness, which is forcefully enabled. And actually on my unit, the alternative mode, which would be to set this to something like user, change display colour space to sRGB. So that achieves sRGB emulation without restrictions, and it gives good results. I prefer using the wide gamut setting. That's because I like to explore the full capabilities of the monitor in terms of the gamut and the representation you can expect with that, and then I explore the sRGB setting separately. There's also MOBA mode, which selectively oversaturates some things. It really brings out oranges and reds and seems to completely desaturate other things. So that could be useful competitively for MOBAs perhaps. Night vision, which gives this sort of night vision filter effect, which is interesting. I'm not sure if that's useful, but it's interesting. And then there's user mode, which, like I mentioned, is similar to racing. But like racing, it doesn't apply any additional filters. You can just control everything as normal through the menu. So it's nice to have two different presets if you want to make some changes in one and then quickly switch between them. So remember I talked about the shortcut keys as well in the full OSD video I did anyway. So if you press the joystick in or press it to the left, that would get up your menu. But there's a button to the left, and if you twiddle the joystick up, to the right or down without entering the main menu system, you can use those shortcut keys. So for example, I could quickly change the game visual preset by just twiddling the joystick up and then selecting one of these. So far I've shown you that I like to have the brightness set to 60, using racing mode, uniform brightness enabled. I make sure that the power saving mode is set to its normal standard setting. If you want to use VRR, then you have variable refresh rate enabled. Some people might like to use ELMB, and that's only available for 120 Hz. That's explored in the review. You have to have variable refresh rate disabled if you want to use ELMB. So most of the rest I left at default, but color temp I switched over to user and I set red to 100, green to 97 and blue to 98. That got close to 6500K on my unit with a good neutral green channel, but each individual unit will vary. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, that's just to show you HDR on the monitor and go through my best settings for HDR. There's a lot less to configure under HDR. Again, you can use VRR at the same time. Brightness is set to 90 by default. If you go to HDR setting and then enable brightness adjustable, which is at the bottom there, I'll just adjust the camera exposure so this is a bit clearer. So yes, if you enable brightness adjustable, you can set the brightness to 100 rather than the default of 90. In doing so, there might be some minor issues with some shades being a little bit brighter than they should be, but I really did not find this obvious in the content I was viewing. I didn't find it problematic to set it to 100, and that does increase your brightness capability of the monitor. So that is what I would suggest trying. If it doesn't look right for you in some of your games, or you're just not comfortable doing it, then the default of 90 is still going to be decent and it's still going to be pretty bright. You also want to disable uniform brightness under HDR. That will give you a lot more brightness. With that enabled, you're capped to just under 500 nits, whereas with it disabled, the monitor can go above 1000 nits quite comfortably for some content. It is a bit annoying that there's only one toggle that applies to STR and HDR for uniform brightness. It should really be something that's remembered separately. The other setting of interest here in HDR setting is Gaming HDR, Cinema HDR and Console HDR. My preference is Gaming HDR. It's a good general out-of-the-box setting really. It gives a nice dynamic HDR experience for a broad range of content using the maximum brightness capability of the monitor, so slightly over 1200 nits. It's the one that's most consistent with other standard HDR modes on monitors, so it's good for me in terms of apples to apples comparison. As always, some content provides a better HDR implementation than others, and I'd suggest making use of any in-game calibration sliders and, if you like, additional HDR calibration tools. Cinema HDR appears similar to Game HDR, including on content I viewed on the PC using the Netflix app, although it could potentially work better for some movie content. Perhaps, I'm not entirely sure, just perhaps. Console HDR, that definitely has its uses, that mode, it's a little bit different. It supports something called HDIG, which some PC and console games support. Generally ones that have their own little calibration slider will support this. It can improve the tone mapping accuracy based on the content itself, rather than using more general so-called dynamic tone mapping data. It appears to be hard-clipped to around 700 nits on this monitor. HDIG relies on HDR calibration provided by the game's HDR calibration tool or system HDR calibration data on games console, or for PCs if you're using something like the Windows HDR calibration tool and you've profiled the monitor using that. People generally find that this provides a more dark biased representation of things, which some could find too dark, but on titles which implement it well, you should still get a huge amount of variety with a great array of medium shades and good highlight detail, at least up to the 700 or so nits limit I mentioned earlier. So I know that was a little bit of a long-winded explanation, but it is important to know how these differ, and again, the Game HDR setting is my general recommendation. It's a good general setting. If I go to the calibration screen for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, with Game HDR for example, I can pull this all the way up. The monitor can use its maximum brightness. If I switch over to Console HDR, however, If you recall, the accurate calibration is with a 700 nit or so limit, so HDR luminance has to be dragged right down to there, or possibly at a push there. This will depend on the game. It's not going to be about halfway for the slider on every game, and some will have actual values as well. So if you're using the HDR calibration app on Windows, this is a 10% window it's showing here. You can go about to there with the console HDR setting. If I switch over to gaming HDR, you can go further. And this does actually show values on the slider, so that according to the slide is up to around 1200 nits, whereas with console HDR, it's around 700 nits. And the same applies to full screen white. It's going to be going up to around 700 nits. That's what it's calibrated up to. And just for completeness, I'll just show you gaming HDR. Again, you can pull that further, up to 1200 nits or so. So yes, gaming HDR and console HDR, they both have their place. Gaming HDR, I would recommend having a play with that to see how you find it. Good general setting. If you don't mind lower brightness and you want greater tone mapping accuracy on some games, that's where console HDR comes in. And the cinema HDR, I'm not entirely sure what advantages that has. I didn't notice any. It was just similar to gaming HDR most of the time. The other setting to be aware of, or settings, screen protection. So there's something enabled by default called screensaver. If you enable this, it appears to dim the edges of the screen. It kind of has this vignetting effect. It's similar to CPC, which is used on some LG OLED screens. And usually you can't disable that unless you go into the service menu. I find this quite annoying, this feature. So to maximize brightness and uniformity, I would recommend simply turning screensaver off. The rest, it's really according to your own preferences, or most of it is. Pixel cleaning is a cycle, and it says there when it's activated, the monitor will be unavailable for around 6 minutes. Would you like to activate it? Now, most OLED screens will just activate their cleaning cycle when you're not using the screen, so it's in standby or you turn it off and then automatically do it if it needs to be done in the background. I prefer that way of doing things, but ASUS seems to prefer you to manually run the cycle. You can set it up with a shortcut key, so if I just press the joystick down, I can quite quickly run that cleaning cycle, but it does seem to be something you have to do manually rather than this monitor automatically doing it at a set schedule. There is a reminder feature, so that will remind you to run the cleaning pixel cycle. It'll give you a message for about, I think it's 10 seconds on the screen towards the bottom right, just to remind you. And you can set that to 8 hour, 4 hour, or 2 hours. Personally, I would recommend just doing this if you're not using the monitor, if you're having a meal or something and you've been using it all day, then run it. Maybe run it a couple of times a day if you're using it a lot in one particular day. I think 8 hours is a fair interval, 8 hours of use of the monitor, sort of running it every 8 hours, cumulative use. That seems to be a decent schedule in my opinion. So it's up to you how you do it. Just be aware that once the monitor's off, so it loses signal to the system, you can't then run the cycle, so you'd need to start running the cycle before that signal is lost. There's a screen move feature. As you can see, I just left it at middle, which I believe is the default setting. I didn't find it annoying. It just occasionally nudges the image into the active area, so it's got an active area of pixels around the image, which the screen can move into. It just moves in each direction every now and then. And that just means that some of the pixels are displaying different content. It's really mainly designed to reduce image retention around edges of some objects. It's not going to affect larger static objects. So for example, if you look at this ball here, if it nudges everything just slightly, then the pixels are still going to be pretty bright, and some of them are actually going to be displaying exactly the same shade anyway. So it's not exactly a magic solution, it's just one of the mitigation measures. I'd recommend just using it, set to middle, see how you find it, set to strong if you can tolerate it, light if you found middle annoying, or off if you really just found them all annoying. And there's also adjust logo brightness. This is designed to dim static elements of the screen. I found this dimming quite a few things which I wouldn't necessarily want it to. So it's not just logos, it will be HUD elements in games, desktop icons, even images on web pages, that kind of thing. They could be dimmed. And I didn't like this inconsistency myself, but if you want that slight extra protection of this feature, then feel free to use this, see how you find it. And that really concludes the best settings. So to look at the remaining settings now, there is Game Plus, FPS Counter. It says FPS Counter, but really it's a refresh rate display. So it will only change if you're using VRR. As you can see here, I've just opened Pendulum Demo and it's changing as the frame rate is changing. You can have a bar graph if you prefer. So that gives you a little indication of the history of the frame rate as well. There's a crosshair option. So there's a little blue dot in the middle there, light blue dot. And you can't have the crosshair at the same time as the FPS counter, in case you were wondering. You can see there are a few different designs. You can also change the position of the crosshair by using the joystick. You can move it right to the corners of the screen if you want. If you select dynamic crosshair, and then you can select a design, so I'm just going to use the big cross so it's clearer. This changes colour depending on the background, so it tries to stand out and contrast with the background shade. So you can see it's now changed to a magenta hue, and then it's gone blue. You get the idea. There's a sniper feature which will zoom in to the middle of the screen. So I've got this set to green dot with a 2x zoom. There's also sniper night vision, which will just add a night vision effect to that. There's an on-screen timer, which will count down from a given number of minutes. So that's in the top left by default, but you can change the position. And just to reiterate, one feature at a time, you can't have multiple features active at the same time. There's a stopwatch feature, which will count up. Again, you can change the position if you want. And last but not least, display alignment, which just gives some little red notches on the screen to help you line up multiple displays. Next, you've got shadow boost. I'm just going to go through this quickly because, to be honest, I don't find this setting particularly useful. We've got Lagom's black levels test open, just so you can have a rough idea of what this does. You can't see what you see to the eye, by the way, but this will give a relative idea of what this does. So this is with it disabled. Level 1 gives a slight boost. Level 2, further boost. Level 3, further boost, but not a massive boost, to be honest. And actually the top row there, the first few blocks remain fairly well blended, even with this set to level 3. Dynamic adjustment gives a big boost, and black does remain black still, so you maintain the contrast, and the top row is more visible. This dynamic adjustment setting could be useful if you want a visibility advantage, but it definitely over brightens a lot of these shades, so it's not accurate at all, and the gamma is really messed up using this setting. And actually I've just disabled it and looked more at the desktop background. It does affect the medium shades quite a bit, or some medium shades. But nonetheless, it's meant for a competitive edge. It's not meant for an accurate look to the image. We've got a few settings I didn't go through here. Contrast, that's the usual control. I'd recommend just leaving this at the default of 80. Vivid pixel, if you increase that from the default of 50, it's a sharpness filter. So it gives extra sharpness to the image. It is a reasonably gentle sharpness filter. It's a lot less aggressive than the ones on some monitors. This could be useful for viewing content in a non-native resolution, for example. If you want to add a bit of sharpness, or just viewing lower resolution content, or just according to your own preferences, but I prefer having this set to 50. And if you decrease it, it will give a softer look to things. Clear pixel edge. This is designed to overcome or make the fringing, or some of the fringing, less noticeable. It doesn't have effect on all of the fringing, as I explore on that article on the website. There are instances of colourful fringing that has nothing to do with text, but this is designed to look at the text, and it really just softens that up. I don't like the look at all. It really makes it look over-softened. I mean, it does make the fringing less distinct. That's just because it's basically like a blur filter or softness filter. And if you try to overcome that increasing vivid pixel, then it doesn't really help. It still just looks weird. So it's really not very easy to see on the video the effect it has. It is just basically blurring text. It doesn't affect other aspects of the image, so it is quite well targeted in that respect, but again, I don't like that blurry look. Next, you've got aspect control. So there are a few different settings here. 16:9, there's full equivalent pixel by pixel, so full will use all pixels of the screen. Equivalent should look at the aspect ratio of the resolution and use as much of the screen as possible without distorting things. Pixel by pixel is a one-to-one pixel mapping feature which will only use the pixels called for by the source resolution. So generally, because it's a 21:9 monitor, I think pixel by pixel is a setting most people would probably want to use. But if you go to full, there are also a few other settings. So fill up, which will use all of the pixels, 27-inch simulation and 24:5 inch simulation. if you want to simulate various different screen sizes. So I'm just going to switch this over to pixel by pixel. And then you'll see it's basically chopped off the edges. It also said that various settings were unavailable with this setting active. For example, you can't use VRR at the same time, but it has actually switched my resolution over for me. So if I go to NVIDIA control panel, I can see that. 2560 by 1440 at 60 Hz. You can increase that and it will still use scaling. You can tell if it's using scaling because it displays the resolution and refresh rate towards the top of the OSD there. It says 2560 by 1440, 120 Hz. And you can also increase it further, so for example 240 Hz. So you might notice PIP, P by P is also grayed out. I've selected esports full now just to show you what that does. That selects a very low resolution, so everything's simple and massive, the kind of look some esports gamers might like. Sets it to 1920 by 1440 by default at 60 Hz, but again you can increase that if you want. So then if you go back to 21 by 9, it sets things back, although it seems to have applied some weird scaling, but that was just a temporary thing. I've reopened NVIDIA control panel and it looks normal again. Pixel by pixel under 21 by 9, by the way, if you're just using the native resolution, that's exactly the same as full, but if you change to another resolution, you can select a different one. You don't have to use the resolution it's given you by default, then that will change the scaling behavior. Next you've got blue light filter. Level 1 is the weakest effect, level 4 is the strongest, level 4 will also lock your brightness to a lower level. It says that it disables variable refresh rate, ELMB and something else, which I missed, I'm sorry. So I will just enable variable refresh rate. Yet blue light filter is still enabled, so I've got no idea why it said that. There's no reason why blue light filter would disable some of those settings, and indeed it doesn't. But anyway, you can see the brightness is grayed out. So I think level 3 might be preferred if you want to use this. A fairly strong effect, and it is an effective low blue light setting, but it does give a bit of a green tint to things. I actually prefer disabling this and setting color temp to 4000K, which is a highly effective low blue light setting, and it doesn't have that green tint. It gives more of an amber look to things, which I find visually better balanced. But whilst I'm here, you can see there are various other options for colour temp as well, from very warm, which is 4000K, up to 10,000K, which is very cool. And not cool as in good, cool as in cool tinted. There's also display colour space, which I showed you, or at least I showed you sRGB and wide gamut. There's another setting, DCI-P3, that will emulate sRGB unless you've changed the colour temperature to one of the pre-selected values. Or the predefined values, sorry, such as 6500K. But as I explored in the review, I don't really see the point in this setting. The gamut is close to DCI-P3 natively, and this just causes some undercoverage, which isn't there natively, so it just decreases your potential accuracy within the DCI-P3 colour space, really. But if for whatever reason you want to have a play around with this, then feel free. Saturation, that's the usual saturation control. Will pull shades closer to the edge of the gamut if you increase it beyond 50 without expanding the gamut itself. That decreases your shade variety. Decrease it below 50 and it decreases the saturation. And you might like this according to your own preferences. It's difficult to balance it though. Some shades become undersaturated whilst others remain quite saturated when you do this. I would recommend trying sRGB instead if you want a less saturated look, with more accurate shade production for standard sRGB content, but have a play with the saturation instead, or potentially as well, according to your own preferences. So yes, eventually it goes grayscale. And there's also 6-axis saturation. If you want finer control, you just want to control red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, yellow separately. So if you're finding reds a bit fiery or overdone, but you like representation of other shades, you might want to decrease this a bit. Again, it can still have the effect of some shades appearing a bit undersaturated, with others appearing quite heavily saturated, and it can be difficult to balance, but it does give you finer control than the main slider, and you can selectively increase things as well. So again, you can just adjust according to your own preferences if you want. The various different gamma settings, 1.8, 2.0, 2.2, which is the default, 2.4 and 2.6. Input select, there's input auto detection, or if you disable that, you can manually select the input. There's PIP, P by P, various different layouts. This is going to be a little bit boring because, as usual, I just have one system connected, but you can see The secondary source would be in that box. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see various different positions for the box. There's also PBP, picture by picture, which is the last three options. So that will give you a side-by-side of the two different sources. And it is two sources maximum, in case you were wondering. And the other options are P by P with different splits. You can swap the primary and secondary sources around, change the preset for each source independently. And sorry, when I said you can swap the sources around, I should have been a bit more explicit. You can actually select what source is used for the primary and secondary. But yes, back to the sizes. There's middle, which I'm showing you there, large, and small. And select that top option there to disable PIP, P by P. Lighting effect, which I've been through. My favourite, which I've also been through. System setups, you can change the language that the OSD is displayed in. You can change the volume or mute anything connected to the audio output. This doesn't have integrated speakers, but it does have some line outputs, and that's how you select which one you're using, the headphone jack, 3.5mm headphone jack or SPDIF. Next is USB setup, KVM. I would recommend you just look at ASUS's video on this. It'll explain it a lot better than I can. I've only got one system connected. But as I understand it, it will load software onto your laptop, for example, if you're using that as one of your sources with USB-C, it will automatically put that on for you, and that will allow you to control the smart KVM functionality. The idea is that you can easily swap between display inputs and also assign USB peripherals to different systems at the same time. Now, maybe I'm misunderstanding how it works, but to me this seems a bit convoluted. I prefer monitors which have everything self-contained in the OSD, don't need additional software to control this, and just allow you to set things up with a kind of wizard thing on the OSD and say, you know, my system connected with DisplayPort will be using Type B upstream, and then I'll have another system connected with USB-C, and then you can even sometimes just have models with one button where you can press that and it will just swap everything for you very quickly. You can also change the Type C bandwidth if you have to, USB 2 or USB 3.2. So as I understand it, if you select USB 2.0, that will give you lower data, but it will give you more bandwidth for the display signal, which is probably more useful really for most people. Or USB 3.2 can increase the data speeds but would limit your refresh rate. You can also select whether you want the USB ports to be on during standby or off during standby. If you select on during standby, they will draw more power even if you're not actually using them, although it is a very small amount of power, just something to note. There's a proximity sensor. I've tested this a bit and I found that sometimes when I was at my desk, perhaps I wasn't really moving enough, and I had this set to high, which I assume is the highest sensor range. It will scan the furthest out. Then I found that it triggered the monitor to dim, which I found kind of annoying. So it might depend on your desk and your setup and how much you move, etc. This could be useful, but it will cause the screen to dim if you're not there, or that's what it's supposed to do, and eventually the screen will turn off. And then when you return to the desk, it should spring back to life quite quickly. Power indicator, which I've been through. Power key lock, that will lock your power key, which is the button to the right of the OSD joystick. So it says power key locked when I try to press that, as opposed to that, turn on or turn off when you press the power key. And I'm just going to press the power key now just to show you how long it takes for the monitor to start up, because it does take a little while, this monitor. Don't worry, I have pressed it. Then it displays this splash screen. Finally starts up. I don't know, that was around 10 seconds maybe. Takes a while. Key lock, I've just activated. It says check quick start guide to cancel this function. But I don't need to. I remember you just hold the joystick in the down direction for 5 seconds or so and it will unlock the keys for you. Power setting, which I've been through. OSD setup, you can change the position. Timeout period, how long after the last button press before it automatically disappears. You can set that between 10 and 120 seconds. There's a transparency effect you can adjust. And you can enable or disable DDC/CI. And that's part of the plug and play functionality of the monitor, which allows you to use software such as DisplayWidget Center, which I'll briefly show you shortly, to control the monitor. There's DisplayPort stream, set that to 1.4 for the full capabilities. If you need to for compatibility, DisplayPort 1.2 can be set. DSC support, if you want the full capabilities, leave that enabled. If you want to forcefully disable it, which will limit your refresh rate, etc. at the native resolution, then you can disable it. Next you've got information that just shows you basic information about the model, such as the name, the color depth that you've got for your signal at the moment. Signal format and the range, so full range RGB 444. I've selected 10 bits at the moment in NVIDIA control panel, so it says 10BPC. And the firmware version, which on mine is MCM 101. That was the latest available at the time of review. And there's all reset, which will reset everything to the factory defaults. So I'm just going to quickly show you DisplayWidget Center, software which can be used to control the monitor. I'm going to go through this quickly. I have shown you this in other videos a bit more comprehensively. There's a link to download this in the description of the video. So you can just select the mode used. So I've got racing selected here, for example. You can change some of these things. It shows things like trace free, but that's grayed out. This is an OLED monitor, it doesn't have overdrive. I'm not sure why the saturation slider was grayed out before with racing, because it should have been available, as it is available in the OSD. Anyway, you get the idea, some basic controls. Game Plus, so you can change your crosshair and that kind of thing. The timer, FPS Counter, display alignment feature, OLED setup, so these are your OLED care features. There is an additional one here, target mode, and that will dim everything on the screen except for the active window. I personally find this really annoying and weird. It's kind of like that Windows Security Center message or whatever it is, the user account control thing that comes up sometimes when you try and run a new program. So I'm not personally a fan, but have a play with it if you want. You can run the pixel cleaning cycle, the reminder, screen move feature, system settings, so a few more things you can play around with. Multi-screen, so you can rearrange windows, although I find Windows 11 has a very good feature for that integrated into it anyway. PIP, P by P, you can select that, change that. And KVM, so you can have a play with the KVM functionality and set up a hotkey for quickly switching between your different sources. And application settings, can check for updates, have it automatically update if you prefer. A few other things there. Can change the theme as well. You might have noticed it had the standard theme originally, I think it was. There's a ProArt theme if you prefer, or gaming, or automatic, which will set this to gaming because it is a gaming monitor. So that's really all there is to the ASUS ROG Swift OLED PG34WCDM's OSD on-screen display menu system. You'll find a link to further videos in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.